when we did that follow-up question for those who felt that their rights were under threat, and we were talking about fundamental rights and freedoms, Republicans, it was basically 3/4 cited either the First Amendment or the Second Amendment. They'd say freedom of speech or freedom to bear arms, the right to bear arms. And some of them would mention a religion. But what was really interesting was the number who mentioned an amendment number, the First Amendment, the Second number. There is even a group that mentioned the Fourth Amendment, what they were concerned about the rights of government, rights of the privacy in terms of privacy and from government interference in their lives. And that was kind of interesting because on the Democratic side, you really had fewer people saying freedom of speech, but they would say other things that were related to that, such as mentioning book bans and those kinds of things.
Welcome to Pod Talks. Pod Talks is a project of protecting our democracy. We bring together the best minds in New Jersey and beyond to talk about the biggest challenges facing our democracy, our institutions, and our personal freedoms. I'm Sean Spiller, Chair of Protecting Our Democracy. Joining us today is Director of the Monmouth University Polling Institute, Patrick Murray, to talk about recent polling results and public opinion relevant to our democracy. Patrick, thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to what I know will be a very exciting discussion with you. Before we begin, though, let me tell our listeners, thank you, a little about you. As I mentioned, Patrick Murray is the founding director of Monmouth University Polling Institute here in New Jersey. He's frequently called upon by media to provide commentary on polling in the political world, including appearances on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, PBS, and National Public Radio. During federal election years, Mr. Murray also serves as a national exit poll analyst for major networks. Mr. Murray has appeared on numerous power lists and one of the most influential people in New Jersey politics. So welcome again, Patrick, and thank you for taking the time to join us.
Good. It's good to be with you, Sean.
Appreciate that. Listen, there's probably a lot of places we could kind of start off, but as a pollster, protecting our democracy, the interface that we see there, I guess it's probably an interesting place to start with you to talk about what you've seen in terms of the change in the electorate over the last number of years. Right, you've been doing polling, you're seeing changes over time. We can talk about polling itself, but the people and the results and what you're hearing and what you're, I guess, feeling, we all talk about in the electorate. What do you think's changed since the time you've been involved?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that's changed in the 30 years that I've been doing this. When I started out at the Eagleton Institute at Rutgers and we were polling New Jersey, it was pretty easy to get people on the phone. We didn't have cell phones. It didn't have caller ID. Which means if the phone rang, somebody picked it up. And as soon as we said we were calling from Rutgers University, the state university in New Jersey, right? People say, okay, I'll talk to you. And that has significantly gone downhill. And you've heard this in the news, right? How can you poll now that response rates are so low? People don't want to talk to you. We are calling cell phones. We're texting cell phones as well to get people to do surveys online. And there are many other ways of doing surveys now than didn't exist when I started out, which was either by telephone, by mail, or in person. That was about how you did it. And now, digitally, we can do things online by texting people, by emailing them, by recruiting them to be part of panels where we go back and interview them again and again. All different ways to do this. But the challenge has been, as response rates have dropped, is who are we missing from our sample? And it used to be, it was a concern demographically. People who had less education, people who didn't speak English, as those numbers increased in the population over the past 30 years, it made it more difficult to get them on the phone. And so, we're making adjustments in order to do that. But then overall, the response rates just started dropping for everybody. And that became a concern. But through the years, we found ways of making up for it, particularly if you're using something like a list sample. That basic demographics about somebody, particularly if we're doing a voter poll. We know something about them from the voter list. We know how often they voted in the past. We know basically their age, their gender. In many states, we know their race or ethnicity as well. because that information is on the list. And then we can make sure that at the end of the day, we're getting a sample of folks who reflect the demographic distribution of the people at large. What has happened in the past few years is that we're now running into problems with segregation in terms of, and I mean self-segregation in terms of the way people think about themselves, where they live, and how they interact with folks. That has created a whole host of problems in terms of their political views. If we're not doing something about politics, we don't seem to run into these problems. But as soon as we start doing polling about politics, then we start running into these problems for some reason. And that has increased significantly once Trump came on the scene 8 years ago. That really changed the dynamic incredibly. Some of the polling that we saw very early, we were one of the first polls at Monmouth University to take Trump seriously when he was running for president in 2015. And what we saw was really interesting was that before he made his official announcement, Republican voters just dismissed him as, a TV, somebody that they knew, but as a TV presenter, not much more. But when he announced that he was running, and he struck a chord with his politics of grievance, and that changed the dynamic significantly. And it changed it in ways in which it really divided people in ways that we hadn't seen before. We always had partisan divides, but we hadn't had divides in such a way as I completely distrust people who were on the other side of the aisle from me. And that had been building for years. I had seen it in our polling for many, many years, going back to the 90s. This growth, this development of this sense that I'm not sure I can trust the other side. I want compromise in government, but I'm not sure I can trust if the other person or the other side of the aisle gets in charge. And that just exploded since Trump became president in a way that has made it extremely difficult to ask questions that we used to ask that didn't have a political overtone, such as, are you getting ahead financially in terms of your family's finances? Are you getting ahead, falling behind, or holding even? There's always some reflection of who's in power at that time, and Democrats are more likely to feel a little more confident if a Democrat's in the White House. Republicans are a little bit more likely to feel confident if a Republican's in the White House. But in the past 5 to 8 years, those kinds of questions have now almost become 100% correlation with what political party you are and which political party controls the White House. So people are not even answering that. They're answering that question in an honest way of stepping outside of their political world and saying, okay, I might not like how Joe Biden is handling these things, but if I'm honest with myself, I'm holding steady. They really won't answer that question that way. They'll answer, I'm falling behind. Even if we ask follow-up questions specifically about where their situation is. And we find that there hasn't been any loss there for Republicans when Biden's in office, Democrats when Trump was in office. That has made it really difficult to poll because people's identities are now so tied up in this tribalism about politics that they can't be honest with themselves about anything. They always have to view whatever they talk about with pollsters or with anybody else through this partisan lens that they've created for themselves, because which tribe you belong to is the defining factor, not what issues are important to you. The combination of, I'm a little bit more Democratic on these, but a little bit more Republican on those, so I'm going to be more Republican. It's no, what's your tribe first? And then you line up your views to agree with that tribe.
Well, certainly, I think you've covered a lot there that kind of speaks, I think, also not just the impact on polling and maybe, causation and effect, but also I think probably as it reflects on our democracy. And I think that takes us to kind of where, I'd say, and I know many are very concerned with what you're describing there. So maybe let's break that down in a few other pieces. If you look at, you mentioned you saw these trends slowly occurring, right? And then Trump kind of jump-started, moved them ahead significantly, right? Oftentimes we hear people talk about, is Trump, the cause of, or is he the product of, right? You hear that framed in a lot of different ways, that he didn't cause it. He was just an example of what was building. And you say a little of that I could maybe pull out from when you say there's been change. Or I could argue the other way when you say, man, we saw Trump come on, this thing really, kickstarted, I think, as you noted. So I guess how would you look at it in terms of why do you think we were on that trend anyway? Maybe that's the best way to go at it. Like, why do you think you were seeing these trends gradually occurring where we were getting more tribal? And I say that as a Mets fan who, knows all about you stick with your team no matter what. So we've been kind of all moving into those spaces.
Even when they trade Verlander, you're going to see,
there's going to be a limit, but we'll
lose games on balks.
Okay.
I'm from Phillies country, so I'm doing okay right now. But seriously, to your question about sticking with your tribe and where that came from, is we can, but many people, including myself, and I haven't written about this, but many people have written about, this goes back to the 1990s. And there was certainly discontent with the two parties, and a sense that the two parties were more concerned about protecting their own and, really not looking out for the little guy. And that made room for this kind of cross-sectional appeal of somebody like a Ross Perot, who said, let's go in there and kick some butt with both parties. And so, you got somebody who, at some point, he may have been even in contention for winning that election. And I won't go back to the 92 election, but he still at the end got 19% of the vote, which was a strong indication that people were just upset with both parties and the sense that they had lost their way. But rather than being a wake-up call for both parties, I think what we saw was, Democrats saying, hey, we survived this. We're still in power. We still control, both Congress and the presidency now at this point. Let's forge ahead. And you had Republicans particularly under Newt Gingrich, who said, I think we've got a way that we can win back at least the House. And that's by kind of gumming up the works, by basically, making government not work. And then if people are unhappy with government, that means they're going to take it out on the party that's in control. And it was an effective strategy because they won the 94 midterms, and then they took control of the House. And then they shut down government, and they got a lot of Republicans who was not in their DNA to take that kind of tactic, to shut down government rather than come up with a compromise to keep government funded. But that was kind of the start. I think many scholars point to that as kind of the start of this. There was, and of course, they lost control a few years later, but there was a sense the Republican Party, I think, at that point in that certain wing that was led by Gingrich, that they had been on the outs. They had not had a majority in the House for more than 40 years. And suddenly they did by making people unhappy with government. And while they might not get continual control, is that they could continue to win back control, and control could seesaw back and forth at the very least if they kept that up. And that gave rise to the politics of grievance. Let's not talk about ways we can compromise on issues. Let's talk about ways that we can, hold government at gunpoint. So what happens is that you get a population who have come of age over the past 30 years who have a sense that government just simply cannot work. So while we say we want compromise, and if we ask those questions in polls, you get people who want compromise, there is that nagging belief that government can't work, can't compromise, which means the default is whoever's going to be in power is going to either agree with you or disagree with you. There's not going to be any compromise, which means let's dig in even deeper in the tribes that we've created. And that was smoldering. We had many opportunities to put that fire out as it developed over the last 20 years that it developed from the mid 90s to the mid 2010s. But then Trump just was the accelerant. on top of the smoldering fire. And it's going to be extreme. I don't know how we dig our way out of this, because we do have a raging forest fire as far as this politics of grievance and this sense that government doesn't work anymore. And I don't think that, incremental measures at this point are going to be able to bring it back. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but that's the answer. The answer to your question is, how did this develop? Is that it was, kind of just feeding and feeding and feeding, and then suddenly the smoldering fire was just pour gasoline on it, and it's out of control now.
Well, I mean, what you described there, I think anyone listening, and certainly for me, I mean that is just an existential threat to our democracy. What you're describing there, right? A system that is now built in some ways on not working. Right, or a function of it is to make sure it doesn't work, and people get frustrated with it. At the same time, you've got grievances being the issue driving so many things. You're in your camp, you're on your tribe, no matter what, and the other side cannot be compromised with. I mean, that's not how a democracy works. Right? Certainly not a healthy one, but it's also maybe how one survives. When you talk about that accelerant put on it, I think many would say, oh, look, January 6th, some of the other things we've seen, those are examples of maybe the countries. If Trump was an accelerant, this is maybe an example of that, being shown by the nation itself with the January 6th, with some of the other attacks overtly on our democracy that we hadn't seen. I would maybe even bring in, now we're seeing it kind of filter into book bans, and we're seeing it into fundamental rights being taken away. We're seeing it, kind of spread into so many parts of our culture and other places. You mentioned before that, where we are now in this raging fire, you don't see a path out of it. Like what do you think we would even try? Like how would we even begin to move out of the situation that we're in now, where we're just struggling and on fire?
Yeah. Well, I mean, my job is to take the pulse of the public, and it's supposed to be a reality check. And what's fascinating is that people aren't open to the reality check anymore. And we've always had, by the way, and this goes back 30 years, even before this really got underway, is that you would always have people question the results of a poll if they personally disagreed with where the majority in the poll stood. And they would say, I don't know people, I don't know anybody like that. And I would point out, well, 40% of the public, say we're interviewing New Jerseyans. So, 46% of 40% of the 6 million people in New Jersey agree with you. It's just that 60% of the 6 million people in New Jersey disagree with you. So it's very easy if there's 2.5 million people who agree with you, that you're going to surround yourself with a bunch of people who agree with you. It's just that 3.5 million don't. And you don't talk to them that often. And what's happened is that we've talked to them even less, because there has been, clear data that shows how people in their movement between the suburbs and the urban areas and rural areas, and this is not just in New Jersey, this is nationally, have over the past couple of decades moved to places where people are more politically similar to them, thus increasing. So like if you go down to, at the county level, certainly, but if you go down to, the municipal and even ward level, you see more and more precincts and wards that have significantly large partisan disparities, that you see fewer and fewer 50-50 or 55-45 splits in election outcomes than you did a generation ago. Now you're seeing, 2-to-1s, 2-to-1 Republican or 2-to-1 Democrat, or even higher, because that's how people are choosing to, to surround themselves. So it makes it very difficult to get folks to focus on. There are people who have differences of opinion with you, and to convince them that that's okay. And the reason why we can't convince them that that's okay is a question of leadership. Again, as I said, my job is to poll the public and, give that reality check. But, as a student of, this republic, and somebody who has read the Federalist Papers and the writings of our founders, is that they were always clear that that the United States population could devolve into factions that would be hard to control. What they hoped they did was set up a system where the people in power, people in leadership, would understand that a loyalty to the institutions in which they have now become ensconced and become leaders is going to be their overriding motivation. That they have a loyalty to those institutions for whatever reason. I mean, it could be self-serving, is that you stay in power. If the institutions are healthy and you're in the institution, then you can stay in power. That's what we've lost, is that our founders didn't think that the public was going to drive this. They thought that the leaders were going to kind of set the parameters for what was acceptable or unacceptable in terms of public behavior. And if you remember, the Constitution was set up at 12 years, 13 years into our independence, because the original government, which was just kind of every state for itself, wasn't working, and we were having a lot of discord and violence in the public. And so they set up a system that said, well, at least let's see if we can control the violence by kind of people having faith that at the end of the day, they might not agree with everything that government is doing, but that they would agree with at least the fact that the institutions are working, that you can trust them. And we're at a situation now where a majority of the public, and there's a poll that we did at Monmouth University just earlier this summer, a majority of the public, both Republicans and Democrats, say that their fundamental rights are under threat, that this government, these institutions are not protecting them. And therefore, these institutions are losing their legitimacy in people's eyes because of that. Now, when we ask Republicans and Democrats which specific rights are under threat, we get a different set of answers. But the fact that both groups feel that the institutions aren't doing their job is a question of leadership, that leaders have allowed government to get so out of control, so dysfunctional, that then it's not doing its fundamental job.
So let's talk about that for a second, because we do often hear, both sides do have these grievances, but they view them as very different things. In that polling, what were some of the things, what were some of those rights that Republicans felt were under threat versus Democrats felt were under threat? Maybe they tell us something about, how we see each other as Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because when we did that follow-up question for those who felt that their rights were under threat, and we were talking about fundamental rights and freedoms, Republicans, it was basically 3/4 cited either the First Amendment or the Second Amendment. They'd say freedom of speech or freedom to bear arms, the right to bear arms. And some of them would mention a religion. But what was really interesting was the number who mentioned an amendment number, the First Amendment, the Second number. There is even a group that mentioned the Fourth Amendment, what they were concerned about the rights of government, rights of the privacy, in terms of privacy and from government interference in their lives. And that was kind of interesting because on the Democratic side, you really had fewer people saying freedom of speech, but they would say other things that were related to that, such as mentioning book bans and those kinds of things, mentioning the right to safety from out-of-control guns. The big right, of course, was, which is in the news recently, was a woman's right to choose. Right to control over your own body was that was the number one thing that came up among Democrats. But we also heard voting in elections, and a host of other things related to that. And that was kind of fascinating to me because you had folks naming fundamental rights on the Democratic side in terms of using, issue nomenclature, such as talking about exactly what it is that they were worried about. Whereas you had Republicans talk more about simply First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, and just naming those as if that was the catch-all for everything. So they're even talking different languages here. And I think what you have is folks who don't even agree what the First Amendment or Second Amendment actually does, and so that was kind of fascinating to me, that you had that kind of that real disparity in terms of not only what issues or rights that they thought were important, but even in the way that they talked about those rights. They had a different language to talk about those rights.
Yeah, I think even listening to you and talking about that poll, it's interesting to me also that even some of those, and let's just highlight ones you can kind of quantify in a way. When you talk about, on one hand, people talk about the loss of freedom to be safe, right, from guns, right, uncontrolled guns, and then on the other side, if you talk about, Second Amendment, your right to bear arms, but I smile in the sense of, but when you look at the Supreme Court now and the decisions that are made. When you look at what's allowed now has to be allowed in states, like there is no restricting of guns right now. It's an expansion in ways. It's interesting. Like you said, where we're just in ways talking past one another and in our camps, no matter what kind of data is out there. But that's interesting to kind of see how people are responding and what they think. As a whole, when you talk about how we are speaking, both sides are speaking different languages. Have you seen any polling that kind of addresses how people feel about each other, meaning kind of the other side? And I'll use that loosely in terms of DR. But, when you talk about how, in any of these pollings, do you get at the issue of how do you feel about somebody who doesn't think the same way you do? Or, how confident are you in being able to work with them? What are you seeing, I guess, in terms of the polls? In terms of Americans' desire and ability to work together.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a real disparity here. For example, when we ask just in general, what do you think of how much confidence do you have in the American people as a whole when it comes to making judgments about our democratic system? And just 11% said that they have a great deal of confidence. Now, another 44% say they have a fair amount, but we still have 4 in 10 who say they really don't have confidence in the American people as a whole. And that's not even getting into what they're saying about how much they trust the other side. Is when we ask them what would happen if the people who had a different point of view from you got in charge. We have significant numbers, and this includes both Democrats and Republicans, who say if the other side got in charge, then I have a great deal of concern that there would be lasting damage to the country. So when you have majorities who are saying something like that about the other side, it's not surprising that you get a number like 81% who acknowledge that as a country, we're just greatly divided on fundamental issues. We're not just divided on, what's the best way to, fund programs or spend government dollars. Is that fundamentally we are just at odds even on what government means and what it should be doing and what the future of the country is. That is a real telling question. And again, it's a question of leadership. I go back to this, that, we're polling what people are responding to in terms of what the leaders are showing them. That you have to have leaders on both sides who are willing to kind of look at the whole host of things that are going on in the world and figure out a way to, call out folks on their side who are doing things that are undermining fundamental faith in our institutions. Unless we've come to an agreement that the institutions don't work, but it doesn't seem that anybody's willing to step forward and say that. Take the Jeffersonian view that every generation should create their own constitution of some sort, or at least revisit the current one that they're working with. We're not willing to say that because our constitution has lasted for so long with all its flaws, but with what had been its strengths up until some years ago, when folks said, undermining the faith in the institutions, undermining how people think about government working is actually good for our short-term political gain. And once we got to that point, then the backstop that our founders saw was, in terms of protecting the institution, was gone. Protect the self-motivation of people in power to stay in power, which means keeping the institutions at least in some modest way, or some minimal public faith.
Well, knowing that I may get a slightly biased answer here, because I would expect nothing less, asking you specifically this question, but you talked about, it relies on leaders, right? Taking a stand at times against maybe something that some of their constituents, in an extreme would be saying, and trying to undermine a pillar of our democracy or something along those lines. What role do you think polling plays in, those same individuals, those same elected officials, right? They're looking at polling, right? And there's constant polling nowadays, right? That shows you what your base is thinking, that shows you what your constituents are thinking, that shows you what, your primary group is thinking, right? If you're thinking of the presidential race right now, right? Everyone looks at the polling and they see what's going on. While polling serves an important role, and again, I know, where I think you obviously you have to come down on there and that, but are there some challenges around the amount of polling we do and the amount of feedback that's given there, which says this is what, the vast majority of your primary voters or voters in your district think, that undermines the ability of the elected officials to do the very thing you're noting, that ability to say, I'm not doing this, when all of their potential primary challengers, when all of their potential opponents, when all of the members of their constituents all see, we all think this way. We all want them to be divisive. We all want them to be, on this grievance. How do you put those two together, and what role has polling specifically played, maybe, in shaping some of the climate that we see now?
Right. I mean, polling's a tool, like any tool. It's a tool like television. It's a tool like artificial intelligence. And it's the question is, how do you use it? You can't ban it. Taking people's opinions about things, you can't ban it. But how do people use it? I think you have a lot of. You have a lot of politicians. I mean, look, the motivation for most politicians, well, let's be honest, whether they want to serve the public or not, but the motivation for day-to-day operations, or if you're in elected office, you have to think about the next election. So that's always going to be your motivation. Even if you say, my motivation for getting into public service was, to accomplish these goals, to serve these people, whatever it is, the only way you do that is by staying in office. And so you hire consultants. And one of the tools consultants use is polling. If polling didn't exist, there'd be other tools that they'd use to convince you to say, in order to stay in public office, you have to do this. So the question is, does polling make politicians more likely to follow what they think is going to keep them in office than if they didn't have polling, but they had other bugs in their ears telling them what they should or shouldn't do? That's a good question. It's a philosophical question. But part of it is less about, what polling's telling you, what your base is. But the fact that the base is so large where you live is also an indication of other things that are going on in the world that don't have to do with polling, such as one of the things I mentioned before, which was kind of the shift in where people live, in that we're politically self-segregating. So now, if you live in a congressional district, that base is larger in that district than it had been. So of course you're going to respond to that base, whether you have polling or not. I think the problem that we have and we faced is that we have this obsession over horse races and all sorts of things. The things that the numbers that I've been talking to you about what I've been trying to do, which is track the underlying nature of public opinion and what it means for the future of our democracy. There are folks there are many of us out there doing that, but it doesn't get as much attention, anywhere near as much attention as any time you put a horse race number out there. And I mean, who are you going to vote for? Candidate A, candidate B, Democrat or the Republican? And that gets plastered because the media can get clicks from that. So it drives, those kinds of things drive a lot. The kind of the sports aspect of who's ahead, how can we handicap this race is much more important. In fact, when I do an election poll, and I've changed the way that I do election polling now, I ask more about likelihood and understanding, what the floor and the ceiling, what do people, not just who's ahead or who's behind. And I don't even ask the question that way in our general election polls anymore. I ask how likely you are to vote for candidate A, and then a separate question about candidate B, because I want to see, how many people have ruled out a candidate and why? Where's the dividing line? Is there any overlap between the two candidates there that people could see themselves supporting either candidate and get a sense of who those folks are? But most people, most pollsters still do this typical horse race poll. And what I found is that when we're trying to do some research on a race to try to find out what issues are at play, and we do media searches, is that we can find very little coverage of the substance of the race, of the issues that are important to people. The vast majority of the coverage, and I mean by vast majority, I mean 85, 90% of the coverage is either one of two things. And it's all based on strategy, where the candidates are in polling and where the candidates are in fundraising. That's 80 to 90% of the, and I don't have an exact number, but it's a huge number of the media coverage is on those two numbers, not on, well, what's the platforms of the candidate? Go out there and talk, and what are the key concerns of the voters in that district, and then an analysis of how the candidates are responding to those concerns. That is missing from our media coverage too. So, this is a bigger problem than just polling.
Go back to chicken or egg, because I hear you there say that. And I think probably two of the biggest complaints that people always talk about are, right, the money in politics, right, and talking about that. And as we noted before, you're just locked into your team as opposed to an issue and who's going to maybe better serve you in their views. And but then we go back to, the voters pick the candidate, and then they're swayed by the districts that are now more segregated, and all the things we note, right? So I guess in all of that, is there anything in the polling that you're seeing? I think, while we understand fundamentally that the challenges facing our democracy, I think in very, very, very clear ways based on, I think, some of the things we're discussing today, are you seeing anything in your polling that leads you to be optimistic? And again, I know your role is to look at the data and see what people think, but are you seeing anything in there that indicates a way that we should say, well, look, this is trending in the right direction for our democracy, or this is trending in a way we can better work together? Is there anything along those lines?
Yeah. So, in getting asked that question, you always try to look for, what's the way out, right? And unfortunately, to be honest, I can't say that there's something positive about the issues that we're talking about right now. You might find little positive things. So, for example, when going back to George Floyd, so now what is that? 3 summers ago, we saw kind of a dent in recognition of the role that race plays in our fundamental cultural divide here that plays out in our political divide too. And by dent, I mean that we saw an uptick in questions that we've been tracking about race and racial issues, an uptick in the number of white respondents who acknowledged that there was something that needed to be dealt with there. There was something fundamental, that this wasn't just something you could scratch the surface on. And we see those every once in a while, that indication of, there's an opening there. But that opening then requires leadership to step in and say, okay, let's do something about this. Let's do something positive about this. Let's take a negative and make it a positive. And unfortunately, that doesn't happen. And then what we usually see is a regression in the numbers. They go back to where they were before. And that's just one example of something that quite frankly is fundamental. We keep coming back to again and again, is the role, we haven't talked about this, but the role that race plays in this kind of underlying cultural political divide as well, is something that if we don't tackle it, we won't we won't be able to move forward. So what I see is that every once in a while there is that kind of moment where the window opens and you can start making inroads. It's not going to be easy, but you can start making inroads. We don't have that moment right now. We've had that moment a couple of times in the past few years, but as of right now, I don't see this. So it's not something where a trend is moving in the right direction. It's something where, as I said, a window opens just a crack, and you've got to recognize it at the time it happens, and you got to jump in and take that opportunity and take advantage of it.
Well, Patrick, I'll say this because I'm always looking for the positive way forward and the optimism. And I think you've given us, as you said, a window there. I'm not going to say that's a huge amount of optimism, but
right.
But I think you're right. It's on all of us to make sure that we are, putting people in positions to kind of take advantage of those opportunities to do something good and to move us in the right direction when those windows open. And while they may be few and far between, we've got to make sure we take advantage of them, and I hope get us on the right track to protect our democracy and doing what we can to help play our role.
And that's the role that polling can play. Is if we do our job right and pay attention to the real issues that are driving, that are underpinning our democracy in terms of public faith in the institutions and so forth, is that if we continue to do our role right, is that we can identify those moments of opportunity, and hope that those in power take.
Right, you're right. Well, we've got to hold people to account to do exactly that. So, well, Patrick, listen, I thanks for the conversation today. Really, really interesting, and I think eye-opening, jarring in some ways, but certainly important. I think that we know where we are. Let's be honest about it, and let's also figure out how we can go forward together. So, thanks so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Sean. I appreciate the time to talk about this stuff.
Excellent. Thank you.